In Swedenborg's masterpiece, Heaven and Hell, he states that there are good spirits and evil spirits with every individual, and that our union with heaven comes through the good spirits and our union with hell from the evil spirits. It is necessary that we have both spirits attached to us because this keeps us in a kind of balance, which means we can enjoy a measure of freedom and choose good instead of evil. Free will is very significant to Swedenborg. These spirits are unaware that they are with humans. While they are with humans, they believe that their memories and thoughts are theirs, but actually they are not. The Lord prevents the spirits from knowing who they are and who they are with in order to prevent communication between humans and evil spirits. However, the spirits can cause a great deal of problems for their hosts. Swedenborg has the following to say about this. I have been enabled to learn where we get the anxiety, distress of mind, and inward sadness called depression. There are spirits who are not yet united with hell because they are still in their first state. They love half-digested and noxious substances, like the foods that are becoming excrement in the stomach. So they attach themselves to the same sort of matter in us because they find delight in it, and they talk with each other there out of their evil affection. The emotional tone of their conversation flows into us, and since it is contrary to our affection, it brings about a sadness and an anxious depression. While if it agrees with our affection, it brings about a sense of happiness and exhilaration. These spirits can be seen in the neighborhood of the stomach, some on the left and some on the right, some lower and some higher, nearer or farther away, variously depending on the affections they are involved in. A great deal of experience has convinced me that they are the sources of our anxiety of spirit. I have seen them, heard them, and felt the anxieties that well up from them. I have talked with them. They have been driven off, and the anxiety has ceased. They have come back, and the anxiety has returned. I have observed its increase and decrease as they drew near and moved away. It has become clear to me then where that anxiety originates that is blamed on a stomachache by people who do not know what conscience is, because they do not have any. Swedenborg wrote these words in 1758. In effect, he was proposing that spirits can cause mental illness. This theory is accepted in many cultures around the world and is called by various names depending on the belief systems of those cultures. Mental illness is seen as a spiritual illness or spiritual emergency, a crisis of spiritual connection. For example, an individual who experiences distress when faced with a difficult life transition might in fact be facing an evolution of consciousness. It may in effect be a mistake to pathologize that process as a mental illness. Swedenborg realized this, and modern-day psychiatrists and psychologists are becoming increasingly open to the idea that alternative theories and treatments such as spirit releasement therapy can be very effective in helping clients to heal. In 1909, Dr. Carl Wickland became chief psychiatrist at the National Psychopathic Institute of Chicago, and he later moved to LA, California. In 1924, he penned a book called 30 Years Among the Dead, and in the book, Dr. Wickland first discusses the interrelationship of the two worlds, the invisible world and the earth sphere. He discusses the subconscious mind and the stage of autosuggestion. Then he presents his methods of research, followed by many, many accounts detailing the results of his psychical research. Wickland discovered, like Swedenborg, that discarnate earthbound entities were affecting his patients and causing them much distress. Wickland's wife was a gifted trance medium and acted as a medium of communication with these entities. These discarnate beings were of superior intelligence and came from other realms in our universe, according to Wickland. These conversations taught him that there were invisible helpers from the spirit world that assisted lost and confused souls and directed them to the light. Wickland compiled an archive of documented cases of spirit possession, including verbatim details of how he cured his clients. Wickland's cases included many stories that explained how these spirits created problems in the lives of their hosts. The offending entities included tormenting spirits, spirits who encouraged the commission of crimes, those who pushed their hosts to commit suicide, or to consume narcotics and alcohol. By carrying out these studies, Wickland, like Swedenborg, was able to establish a connection between spirit obsession and possession and various types of mental illness. His theory stated that discarnate entities, lacking physical bodies, are attracted to the light and auric field that emanates from all living humans. Certain physical conditions, such as a depleted nervous system or sudden shock, can make humans more susceptible to penetration by entities. Neither human nor entity is conscious of the presence of the other. Nevertheless, the result may be a change in personality and insanity, including all types of dementia, hysteria, epilepsy, melancholia, shell shock, kleptomania, idiocy, religious and suicidal mania, amnesia, immorality, and even bestiality, according to Wickland. These entities account for a great deal of unhealthy thoughts, emotions, gloomy moods, irritabilities, unreasonable impulses, bursts of temper, and uncontrollable infatuations. Wickland assigns the terms obsession and possession to these phenomena and notes these date back from the remotest antiquity to modern times. He states that many examples can be found in the writings of Christianity. The term obsession is defined as the abnormal influence of spirits on the living. Wickland explains that the condition can be treated by what is known in modern times as spirit releasement therapy. Through this method, communication is established with an entity through a medium, and the entity is released from its condition of spiritual darkness. This process requires a great deal of preparation and practice, however, and Wickland warns that it is not to be undertaken without the appropriate precautionary and protective measures. Wickland became highly proficient with this method, in concert with his wife, who acted as intermediary. Mrs. Wickland acted as an unconscious trance channel during the procedure. Her eyes were closed and she remained suspended in a sleep-like state, with no recollection of what had transpired afterward. The entities would use her body and voice to communicate with Dr. Wickland. Wickland explains that she was protected by a group of strong intelligences that he called the Mercy Band. He dedicated his book to his wife and to the Mercy Band for their efforts. Dedicated to my wife Anna W. Wickland, whose humanitarian impulses and unselfish devotion to an ideal have made this research possible, and to the invisible co-workers who have so faithfully inspired and guided our efforts. One of the first messages Mrs. Wickland received from discarnate entities was that mortals do not understand the conditions that prevail after the death of their physical bodies. To quote Wickland, they stated that in reality there is no death, but a natural transition from the visible to the invisible world, and that advanced spirits are ever striving to communicate with mortals to enlighten them concerning the higher possibilities that await the progressive spirit. But death, the freeing of the spirit from the body, is so simple and natural that a great majority do not realize the change and continue to remain in their earthly haunts. Many spirits are attracted to the aura of living humans and affect the behavior of those humans through obsession and/or possession. The result of this might be immorality, crime, and seeming insanity. Once these obsessing entities were freed, they could be then reached by advanced spirits who would care for them, instruct them regarding the higher laws of life. Wickland relays many detailed stories of how messages were relayed through his wife. Here is just one of them. During his early medical studies, he was required to take part in some dissecting work. Students were directed to dissect a lateral half of a body, and the first subject was that of a man of about 60 years of age. Wickland's task was to dissect a lower limb. He returned home that evening to find his wife suddenly ill. She complained of feeling strange and dizzy and unstable. As he placed his hand on his shoulder to steady her, she went into a trance and heard a foreign voice emanate from her. It said, "What do you mean by cutting me?" Wickland answered that he was not aware of cutting anyone, but the spirit angrily replied, "Of course you are. You are cutting on my leg." At this point, Wickland realized the spirit owner of the body on which he had been dissecting had followed him home. He spoke with the spirit through his wife after helping her into a chair. The spirit objected, telling Wickland he had no business touching him. Wickland responded that he had the right to touch his own wife. The entity exclaimed, "Your wife? What are you talking about? I'm no woman, I'm a man." Wickland then explained to the spirit that he had passed out of his physical body and was controlling the body of Wickland's wife, and that while his spirit was in the room, his body was back at the college. He told the spirit, "Suppose I were now cutting on your body at the college. That could not kill you, since you yourself are here." The spirit, admitting this was reasonable, and responded, "I guess I must be what they call dead, so I won't have any more use for my old body. If you can learn anything by cutting on it, go ahead and cut away." The spirit then asked Wickland for a pipe, saying he was dying for a smoke. Wickland notes the fact that his wife had always abhorred the sight of tobacco, and this precluded the possibility of her subconscious mind playing any role in the episode. After Wickland gave the spirit a more detailed explanation of the fact that he was actually dead, the spirit realized his true condition and left. Wickland gives many more examples that demonstrate the extent to which spirits may cling to their earthly bodies through ignorance of their transition or so-called death. However, he also notes there are spirits who stubbornly refuse to understand that they have made the transition out of the physical. And in these cases, the spirits must be forced to leave the host. This is how Wickland describes the process. The transference of the mental aberration or psychosis from a patient to the psychic intermediary, Mrs. Wickland, is facilitated by the use of static electricity, which is applied to the patient, frequently in the presence of the psychic. Although this electricity is harmless to the patient, it is exceedingly effective, for the obsessing spirit cannot long resist such electrical treatment and is dislodged. The similarity between the actions of the controlling spirit and the symptoms of the patient, as well as the relief obtained by the latter through this removal, indubitably prove the spirit to have been the cause of the disturbance. In many cases, the identity of the spirit has been unquestionably authenticated. Wickland notes that the patient gradually recovers, but in cases where there are a number of spirits requiring removal, the process may need to be repeated. Wickland's investigations into this phenomena spanned 30 years. He acknowledges that modern psychologists disclaim the possibility of foreign intelligences, even in the cases of multiple personalities, dissociated personalities, or disintegrated states of consciousness. However, Wickland says that, to the contrary, his research has proven that the majority of such intelligences are oblivious to their transition and thus do not recognize they are spirits. He says that unenlightened spirits often wander aimlessly for many years in the earth sphere due to their lack of knowledge of a higher spirit world. This ignorance creates in the spirits a condition of confusion, monotony, and suffering. Many remain in the scene of their earthly lives, continuing their former activities, or falling into a heavy sleep from which it is difficult to arouse them. Wickland's findings of the 1920s support what Swedenborg discovered in the 18th century. In the 60s and 1970s, another psychologist who worked with the mentally ill was stunned to confirm Swedenborg's theories as well. Dr. Wilson Van Dusen, psychologist at Mendocino State Hospital in California, concluded after 17 years of working with the mentally ill that man's life depends on his relationship to a hierarchy of spirits. His conclusions, based on careful research, have radical implications for the diagnosis and cure of many mental illnesses. Van Dusen studied Swedenborg, world religions, science, metaphysics, and he trained as a clinical psychologist. His patients suffered from various types of hallucinations, including visions, and in addition heard voices. He noticed after 3 years of studying patients who hallucinated that there were striking similarities between what his patients described and Swedenborg's 18th century description of the relationship between man and spirits. This amazed him because hallucinations were a source of puzzlement in the psychiatric community. How could it be that Swedenborg's system was an almost perfect fit with the experiences of his patients? Van Dusen studied hundreds of patients. To his surprise, he discovered it was possible to converse with the voices that patients heard during their hallucinations. He was careful to study patients who were able to distinguish between their own thoughts and what they experienced during their hallucinatory experiences. He presents a very different picture of persons suffering from mental illness than is understood by the general public. The term raving lunatic should never be used to describe them. Rather, patients become entangled, he said, in their own internal processes, and as a result have difficulty carrying on with the business of life. His subjects all experienced hallucinations. They included chronic schizophrenics, alcoholics, those described by Van Dusen as senile, and individuals who suffered from brain damage. Patients were not offered any reward for participating. Van Dusen stressed the need for establishing good rapport with his patients so they would trust him and feel safe disclosing their experiences. Van Dusen described the process as follows. I struck up a relationship with both the patient and the persons he saw and heard. These voices were sometimes frightened of me and themselves needed reassurance. I would question these other persons directly and instructed the patient to give a word-for-word account of what the voices answered or what was seen. In this way, I could hold long dialogues with the patient's hallucinations and record both my questions and their answers. My method is that of phenomenology. My only purpose was to come to as accurate a description as possible of the patient's experiences. Van Dusen found that he could engage in conversation with the hallucinations or voices of his patients. Most of them were puzzled about what was happening to them and even frightened. Because of this, they were reluctant to disclose information at first. Most patients had their own terms for the hallucinations and came up with nicknames and terms for their voices. They thought of the voices as another world or order of beings. Van Dusen became convinced that what his patients described were not thoughts or fantasies. To the patients who gave them names such as the other order and the eavesdroppers, they were very real. However, since they realized most people did not share their experiences and did not understand them, they learned not to talk about them. Most of the time, the voices would insult, threaten, and attack the patients, which resulted in much fear on the part of the patients. One of the most significant things Van Dusen learned about the hallucinations was that they seemed to divide themselves into two different orders: lower order voices and higher order voices. The lower order voices tormented their hosts and sought to control the patients. This often included the attempt to control some part of their physical bodies. This phenomenon made Van Dusen think about ancient writings, including those of the Christian Bible, that describe demonic possession. The lower order voices relentlessly attacked the patients with their constant screaming, shouting, demeaning, lying, and even threatening harm and death. The goal seemed to be to break the will of the patient and establish control and dominance over them. Many patients fell into despair because they could not escape the constant shouting and plotting of the voices. Van Dusen reports that according to the higher order beings, the purpose of the lower order is to illuminate all of a person's weaknesses and wear them down over time. The lower order usually do not identify themselves, but accept most names or identities that are given to them. A lot of the patients made up nicknames for them. These voices were not able to report any more than the patient sees, hears, or remembers. They do not reason logically or demonstrate any higher order thinking. They talk endlessly, which the patients found extremely annoying and troublesome. They were unable to function in the real world with voices constantly shouting at them and threatening them. Van Dusen found that all of them were either not religious or anti-religion. The mere mention of religion made them angry. One patient's voice claimed to be Jesus Christ. However, Van Dusen knew, because of its words and attitude, it was merely a lower order entity. The higher order voices spoke in words and terms completely opposite to those of the lower order. Unfortunately, higher order entities made up only about 1/5 of the voices that Van Dusen communicated with. Where the lower order voices attempted to control the patients, illustrate their weaknesses, and tear them down, the higher order beings were helpful, caring, respectful, highly symbolic, and religious. They were like wise sages. One voice Van Dusen spoke to identified herself as an emanation of the feminine aspect of the divine. She herself was not divine, but she was an emanation of the divine. Van Dusen says these beings told him the purpose of the lower order was to make the patients conscious of their weaknesses and faults. The higher order beings claimed to have power over the lower order, and Van Dusen often called upon them to help, counsel the patients. He tells this story about one of his patients. He had heard the lower order arguing a long while how they would murder him. He also had a light come to him at night like the sun. He knew it was a different order because the light respected his freedom and would withdraw if it frightened him. In contrast, the lower order worked against his will and would attack if it could see fear in him. When the man was encouraged to approach his friendly son, he entered into a world of powerful numinous experiences, in some ways more frightening than the murderers who plotted his death. In one scene, he found himself at the bottom of a long corridor with doors at the end, behind which raged the powers of hell. He was about to let out these powers when a very powerful and impressive Christ-like figure appeared, and by direct mind-to-mind communication, counseled him to leave the doors closed and let him into other experiences which were therapeutic to him. Van Dusen was an ardent student and admirer of Emanuel Swedenborg's work. After completing his research, he concluded that Swedenborg's doctrines regarding the spirit world and its connection to humans correlated perfectly with his own findings. Swedenborg saw humans as the meeting ground of a great hierarchy of beings. These beings existed on different levels, but acted in correspondence with each other. For example, the Lord acts through celestial angels, who exist in the celestial heaven. Spiritual angels act on a lower spiritual level of heaven, and these in turn act on a third level of heaven, which corresponds to man. Since there are 3 levels of hell, the same is true there. Man is the great meeting point of these hierarchies. Good rules through the hierarchy of beings on the heavenly side, and evil rules through the hierarchy of beings on the hell side. This is why humans are influenced by both good and evil, and each human, because of free will, must make a choice as to which path they will take. To quote Van Dusen, good and its opposite evil rule through this hierarchy of beings down to man, who stands in the free space between them. Out of his experiences and choices, he identifies with either or both sides. These influences coming from both sides are the very life of man. The man who takes pride in his own powers tends toward the evil side. The man who acknowledges that he is the receptacle of all that is good tends toward the good side. When Swedenborg was writing about communicating with spirits, there was no such thing as a diagnosis of schizophrenia. That did not come about until about 1911. But what he describes about obsession, to be caught in false ideas, and possession, to experience an intrusion of alien spirits influencing behavior and even the physical body, sound a lot like the modern idea of psychosis. Swedenborg wrote that there's a barrier in place between the world of humans and the invisible world of spirits. They are kept separate and unaware of one another. His explanation for why this is so is because when spirits develop some awareness of themselves as separate entities, they try to act into the conscious mind of man. What happens when evil spirits enter man's consciousness? Swedenborg's observations matched those found by Van Dusen centuries later. Here's a summary of what both men found. These evil spirits attempt to destroy the host, cause anxiety or pain, speak in the person's native tongue, seek to destroy conscience, interfere with religious practices, seem to be against every higher value, suggest acts against the person's conscience, and if refused, threaten and try to overcome the patient's resistance. They can also impersonate and deceive. Here is a direct quote from Swedenborg. When spirits begin to speak with man, he must beware lest he believe them in anything, for they say almost anything. Things are fabricated by them, and they lie. For if they were permitted to relate what heaven is and how things are in the heavens, they would tell so many lies, and indeed with a solemn affirmation, that man would be astonished. They are extremely fond of fabricating, and whenever any subject of discourse is proposed, they think that they know it and give their opinions one after the other, one in one way and another in another, altogether as if they knew. And if a man listens and believes, they press on and deceive and seduce in diverse ways. Von Dusen and Swedenborg also both noticed that the voices of the lower order threaten to take over the world, suggest strange acts to the patient, and then criticize the patient for carrying them out, draw attention to sexual topics, and often refer to the person as a machine. They also found that the evil spirits sometimes tried to possess and control a part of the patient's body, especially the ear, eye, tongue, and genitals. Van Dusen notes that medieval literature uses the terms incubi and succubi to designate intercourse between a person and a possessing spirit. Did Von Dusen find any differences between his conclusions and those of Swedenborg? Only with regard to how many spirits could be with one patient. Swedenborg thought there could be 3 or 4 most frequent voices, but these could experience a number of different people. And he also wrote that sometimes spirits come in clouds of people at a time. Von Dusen learned that where there's a split between the internal and external experience of a person, such as in schizophrenia, there can be many spirits with a person, and that one spirit can be the voice of many. They were in a kind of hierarchy. What about what Von Dusen termed the higher order hallucinations? Swedenborg called these angels who come to assist the patient, who reside in the interior mind. For this reason, these angels communicate not in words but in universal symbols, and they act as helper guides for the patient. These entities are not as prevalent as the lower order entities. They do not act against the free will of the patient. How did Swedenborg break the barrier and communicate with the spirit world? According to Von Dusen, Swedenborg engaged in minimal breathing and concentrating inwardly for most of his life, a practice like yogic pranayama, breathing, and pratyahara, sense withdrawal. Why was Swedenborg able to interact with the invisible world of spirits and maintain his sanity when such interactions had the capacity to psychologically destroy others? Some might reach the conclusion that he was himself insane. However, this makes no sense, since he demonstrated a lifetime of appropriate behavior and superior intellect. His work as a scientist and his prolific writings could not have been produced by someone who might be described in his time as mad. The fact that Swedenborg's findings correlate so strongly with what both Wickland and Von Dusen found centuries later illustrate that maybe it is time for us to rethink modern-day notions of mental illness.